Welcome everyone to the J3U podcast. I'm John Jewett, your host, and with me as always is co-host Luke Miller. How's it going, Luke?
Pretty good, man. Excited for today's topic.
Definitely. And we have the honored guest, Dr. Dean St Mart. He's a formulator for supplement needs, also a PhD in organic chemistry. He's worked as a chemical engineer and is a competitive bodybuilder as well. So Dr. Dean St Mart, welcome to J3U podcast.
Brilliant, John. Thank you very much for you and Luke chasing me down to get on the podcast. I've been looking forward to coming on to chat about what we're going to speak about today.
Yeah, I've been following you for a while. I initially came across you through trainedbyjp.com and putting out information there, and a very thought out approach, digging into actual science and trying to find out, like I had mentioned, like finding the whys to why things are happening in the body, and then applying the hows of what we should be doing to address problems, or just coming up with some type of framework of how we should be applying safer use PEDs. And not just that, but also health considerations. And that goes into training, nutrition, everything that we do. And so with what I'm trying to do is, of course, bodybuild, our goal is ultimately try to build muscle. It's such a lower level kind of goal, but big picture, we want to be able to do this for a long period of time. And we do run into issues in this process of being enhanced bodybuilders. Specifically, what I want to talk about today was around the digestive issues, which they occur. And we see a lot of like Band-Aids that get thrown into this mix of like, oh, I have reflux, we'll take an antacid or a protein pump inhibitor. And it's not solving the root issue. And so that's what I really wanted to dive into today. Like, what are these root issues that we're getting around and how do we address them? So maybe you can kickstart us off with just the general, like, what are these main digestive issues that you have come across working with bodybuilders? And then we'll kind of go down the rabbit hole of what the background is on those.
Yeah, so as you touched on, when it sort of comes to digestive issues with bodybuilders, they tend to either just ignore the problem. So it could be someone in the middle of an off season that's pushing very high volumes of food and ignoring the fact that their gut is quite distended, they have gas, they have toilet issues, and just keep hammering food in the hopes that something sticks. When we start to see digestive issues arise, it's starting to tell us there's something either within our digestive system. So with the digestive system, I classify that as the stomach, the liver, the pancreas, and the small intestine. And obviously your mouth and chewing, that's a given. But in terms of the main organ systems, stomach, liver, pancreas, small intestine. When guys start to develop, say for example, stomach reflux, stomach acid reflux, we have to then consider what is actually causing that stomach acid to be produced in excess. Or is it actually a physical issue whereby the sphincter at the bottom of the esophagus or the top of the stomach is now completely relaxed and is allowing some stomach acid to actually burn the lower lining of the esophagus? So this sort of can be applied to both natural and enhanced athletes, this digestive stress, because of it can be then elicited through increased food volume. So your digestive process slow down. You're not making enough stomach acid to break down animal protein and flesh. You're having skewed release of lipase from the liver and pancreas that breaks down fats. And that ultimately then just leads to malabsorption when everything arrives in the small intestine. If stuff isn't adequately broken down to be absorbed, because you have to think stomach is what does the digestion and the breaking down. It's actually the small intestine that takes the nutrients and takes it into the body itself to be transported for nutrient delivery and partitioning. So we have to then assess, is it that mechanical or physical fault that's happened? Or have we now generated a problem where we have a lack of stomach acid, either induced by chronic ingestion of foods that are quite allergenic to that person, or all stemming to what we're sort of go down the rabbit hole in a while about is histamine, and failing to appreciate high levels of protein will ultimately raise histidine levels. So histidine is an amino acid and it feeds into histamine production. So as an after cause of eating high protein, you're going to generate large amounts of histidine. which will then play into histamine production. And that histamine then can play either into increase in gut motility, so you end up with diarrhea. It can play into those proton pumps that you spoke about a moment ago that facilitates hydrogen ion secretion into the stomach to generate hydrochloric acid. And that in itself then is obviously going to raise the amount of stomach acid you're producing and feed into that reflux. So there's several things that we have to consider from a dietary perspective. And then there's all these hidden things that, again, people tend to not really think about. And that's, gut pathogens, a disbalance in terms of gut flora, opportunistic yeast infections, parasites. The list is endless when it comes to the actual intestine and contributing to poor gut health and digestive stress.
So is that, going through this, you initially have someone that's going into this off-season phase and starting to push higher food volumes, and maybe they've never had issues before, but you're saying just the mechanical level, like of actually reaching this volume where there's maybe some limit just naturally with that, hey, we're just not going to be able to produce enough, maybe stomach acid, digestive enzymes, lipase enzymes to handle this food volume. And maybe this isn't even PED related. And yeah. that there is, because in my understanding, like for most of the time, we're going to be able to have a sufficient production in pancreatic enzymes, stomach acid, but when these extremes happen that you're just unable to produce this amounts, then that's when the digestive processes like have issues. So before even getting, I guess, into the PED realm and talking about like histamine and what's driving that, for someone that just truly like, hey, I have large food volumes and now I'm insufficiently creating like maybe not enough stomach acid or maybe not enough enzymes, would just the simple fix from there be, hey, add in some digestive enzymes or butane HCl or something like this before having to dive further down to some other mechanisms?
You could. So again, what you're sort of getting to there is that there's just an insufficiency where the body's genetic capability to produce these enzymes has hit its rate limiting step.
Yeah.
So again, there's even genetic issues in certain individuals where someone may not be producing as much lipase as another person. And that in itself could feed into, diabetic problems where you're not breaking down fat efficiently and leading into the other sort of health implications of having increased fats within our body in terms of fatty liver disease, etc. That all has a mechanistic role in developing, type 2 diabetes. So for someone in that regard, if they weren't making enough lipase on a genetic level, then yeah, adding in lipase or a specific pancreatic enzyme that's required, that's in, I guess, a deficiency would be the first step of action. But because we know it's not actually something that's being driven by the food itself, it's just that the body doesn't have that capability to make up for that food volume.
It's tough. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say the other sort of side to it then is you tell that person to, do regular bouts of fasting to give those organs a break, basically. Same way that we'd approach improving insulin sensitivity and increasing, insulin output of the beta cells, the pancreas, we'd lower carbohydrate consumption. It depends on, time frames for that athlete. Can they afford to do, chronic periods of fasting for a short period of time in order to just gain back a level of appetite even as well? And, take advantage of that, I guess, mitigating motor complex that's in our gut that cleans out any of those sort of autophagy, we're breaking down debris that's within the small intestine and clearing it out. That can play an important role then towards digestive health overall as well.
That might have jumped around to the end of what our conversation was of like solutions of things, but like we bring up like what all these things could be, like with food volumes, decreased lipase input, maybe increase in histidine, which is driving that histamine issue, gut pathogens, gut dysbiosis. Like now you have this list going through of like, to even disseminate of like, where do you even start with this if you're having that issue? And I guess I don't want this to expand to where we're so general and broad, right? Because each thing is addressed, but also someone listening, you're like, where do you start with that, right? If you're having this issue pop up, like, hey, I'm having reflux or some gas, and it's like, I have all these things, avenues to look at. So that's a tough one to navigate. Maybe if we could touch on it, but I know that's a whole podcast on itself.
Yeah, I think that the simplest way that we have to always view this is what is triggering the issue, and that's food intake that's then driving the digestive distress or the digestive dysregulation. And quite simply, then we go down the route of either, doing a elimination diet, or we strip it back to single food ingredient diets where we completely eliminate any influence from a chemical perspective of, say, processed foods where there's multiple ingredients within our food, and we strip that right back to something simple where we can start to then slowly add in, I guess, multi-ingredient foods until we start to see a problem arise. I guess the other thing that people fail to realize or even think about is even something as simple as bread, where it's a multi-ingredient food. Anything that you ingest ultimately ends up, being digested or assimilated, and the liver plays a key role in that. And if your liver's having to do biotransformations of several different chemicals that's coming in from your food, you're adding to the overall, what you could call, toxic burden to your body. So that in itself plays a hidden role that most people don't even think about. They'll just view, oh, I'm eating bagels. Bagels is bread. That's a single food ingredient, when it's not really. You have to really think critically of what's actually going into the system and then strip them back from there, basically. And you're talking going right back to like boring, single grains, oats, rice, lean proteins. You're really going back to basic foods and then building from there to see what actually triggers the problem.
Yeah, and that makes sense. That's a common approach of like looking at your food map type foods that cause bloating, gas, and kind of like your normal culprits that we start working with. So that might be a good starting point. But I guess let's paint the situation so we can actually get into the topic we're really going to hit, which let's make the assumptions that we've been following this diet where we have great digestion. There's no issues present currently, gas, bloating, no reflux. And then we have the introduction of performance enhancing drugs. Maybe this is a higher level because we have these guys that blast and cruise, right? Or HRT into like a higher dosage of compound levels. And then let's say the diet doesn't change, and all of a sudden we have now presentation of GI distress. There's reflux occurring. And so now we can maybe we can pinpoint this a little bit more, like, hey, my foods haven't changed. Other lifestyle factors haven't changed. My stress is still managed. Sleep is the same. And we pinpointed down like, hey, something's going on with these compounds I've introduced. And so let's start that conversation with you around how androgens would impact digestive processes.
Yeah, so how I sort of put this simply in the past was any side effect that comes from androgen use is androgen receptor activation. You're always going back to, I have X side effect, other than, we can't classify estrogen because that's an aromatase conversion, but any side effect we tend to see from health consequences with AAS use, it's androgen receptor activation or nuclear steroid receptor activation. So from a positive perspective, androgen receptor activation in terms of our muscle tissue is a positive in that we activate the androgen receptor. It causes transcription of a gene, which then leads to translation of a protein and so forth, and, increased protein accretion. So we see this positive effect from docking to a muscle androgen receptor. But throughout the whole body, there's androgen receptors on every type of cell in our body. And our immune system is also rich in androgen receptors also. So as sort of an aside to sort of set this sort of conversation up, you'll hear guys talking about test flu, which in other words is androgen receptor activation following a supraphysiological elevation in testosterone within your body. And what that does is it irritates your monocytes and your macrophages to basically become irritated and seek out a pathogen in the body. And that's why we find for, a period of maybe 2 weeks, when someone begins under endeavor to a supraphysiological level, they feel quite run down because their body's actually trying to respond to something that's not even there. Now, when we break down our immune system into the different types of cells, We then have what are known as mast cells and our basophils. And the mast cells and basophils secrete histamine in order to combat any pathogens, bloodborne pathogens. And our mast cells are contained within granulocytes, which are mainly around our connective tissues. They tend to store histamine in response then, if a pathogen does invade, they're able to release the contents of the granule, which is a flood of histamine into our body. This is sort of where then a couple of years ago, when Luke Sandow had asked me about having bad digestive problems during his prep, I started to really critically think, like, this wasn't something I thought really beforehand. And then I said, actually, what is causing that problem? Like, there has to be a clear root cause to why people are suffering with digestive stress when they use androgens. And then I started to look at some old papers and immunostaining of mast cells for androgen receptor sites, and they were flooded with androgen receptors. So in other words, we have the same scenario happening like with test flu, whereby when someone's androgen level is elevated, it's actually irritating those mast cells to release histamine into the body in anticipation of fighting off a pathogen. But what ends up happening is that histamine can arrive, you know, if it's traveling throughout the whole body, it can arrive at the stomach and then drive that proton secretion into the stomach and drive stomach acid up. Now, when we look at compounds or medicines that sort of treat that side, Zantac, which is now, it's sort of a gray area medicine towards controlling stomach acid due to probably the incidence of cancer. But that was sort of the first implemented drug as a H2 antagonist that basically bound to the histamine receptor within your stomach and just said, stop making stomach acid. Very potent, very easy to take and then treat that stomach acid secretion in response to digestive stress. So a couple of years ago when Zantac was available, that was sort of the solution I gave to Luke at the time. Was obviously we can't remove some of this stress in terms of what it takes to prepare for a contest, but we can do sort of the conventional approach with medicine, and let's try and take care of the symptoms so that it improves the quality of life. And that got him through the last 8 weeks of his prep using the antihistamine. Now, what we really want to consider, I guess, is what breaks down histamine in the body. And that's an enzyme known as DAO, or diamine oxidase. And that helps to oxidize histamine and allow it to be excreted as a pyrrole byproduct.
Hey, Dr. Dean, but before
Yeah.
you started addressing like the histamine process, just to go back a second,
Yeah.
you had mentioned for one, like the acute introduction of PEDs and this driving up of the inflammatory process, but also because under my understanding, there's also immune suppressive effect that higher androgen use can present. Are we looking at different timelines for these, one being acute and one over a longer duration of, and how do you separate out those two?
So when we look at how, I addressed this last year when people were worried about the current environment and elevated androgens, was that androgen use, elevated androgens actually have a sort of polar effect when it comes to the immune system. On one side, it upregulates, and it upregulates the innate immune system. So the innate immune system is our first line of defense. So that's our macrophages, our basophils, monocytes. Monocytes would be the main sort of macrophages and neutrophils, the ones that actively try and neutralize an invading pathogen. And then the adaptive immunity, in terms of the monocytes, your B cells, T cells, they become suppressed by elevated androgen use. So your adaptive immunity, in terms of remembering and combating an incoming pathogen, becomes affected. But your innate immunity is what actually gets upregulated. You produce more white blood cells in response to an elevated level of androgens. But like everything, if the innate immune system can't find what is being presented to it as a pathogen, then there is an adaptive mechanism where that immune response dies down. We still have that slight elevation and I guess that innate immunity trying to seek out what's present, but there's no longer that same cytokine signaling from the elevated androgen use. So we tend to see then that the immune system becomes adapted to that supraphysiological dose after a period of say 2 to 3 weeks. And that's where we see that test flu drop off as we adapt to that higher androgen load.
But for some people, does that always happen? Because if we still see this like effect present with the GI issues, it's probably still not going away. Or it could just be the fact that like throughout a contest prep, there's a constant reintroduction of greater PEDs along the way. So that's probably the variable too. And then all coupled with going into a further starvation state and higher fatigue state. But so maybe that's hard to pull out of what is happening there.
That was another thing that I touched on last year when I was sort of discussing how people should view their immune system health in terms of the current pandemic. And that was, yes, your immune system will suffer in terms of your adaptive immunity, but what's more so worrying is actually a competitive bodybuilder in a pre-contest phase, whereby 60% of your total energy intake is actually going to your immune system. So when you're like in the depths of your prep 8 weeks out where you're severely under your sort of maintenance calories and you are actively in that deficit, your body's energy demands aren't actually going to what fuels your day-to-day activities. You're actually then suppressing your immune system in that regard. And also then we have, certain individuals that don't then partake in very nutritious pre-contest diets where there's a lack of micronutrients, lack of vitamin A, unless they are actively taking supplements that boost vitamin A and vitamin D, they are going to be in a micronutrient deficiency state also. So there's all that sort of to take into account when we think of how the immune system suffers with AAS use as well.
No, I'm glad we touched on that to separate it, because with COVID and such a big talk around the immune system, now we have immune system, just this really big umbrella term, and nothing's really separated out. You're like, it's just, everything's like immune system boosting. It's an immune booster. Oh, great, take it all, right? It's like, there's a lot of like nuance that's very important nuance that to discuss within that and separate out what's raising like the innate or the adaptive effects. And so I'm glad we just like went back just to touch on that slightly. My other question too would be on, we have this increase in basophils, which drive an increase in histamine, getting more activated. And within lab work, is this something, if someone was to draw labs around this time period, maybe you've seen it, a change of, well, like you see this elevation in the percentage of basophils, maybe comparatively to neutrophils or et cetera, like, and does that coincide with maybe what they would be seeing subjectively with this GI distress?
Yes, you will see the elevation in basophils. If someone is having a chronic histamine issue in terms of an allergic reaction, so we have to sort of view this increase in histamine as a potential allergic reaction where these basophils are secreting histamine to kill off something, or like we say, they're being provoked by a chemical within the body. But you will see an increase in basophils in blood work in someone who has chronic, sinus issues, chronic congestion in the head. We don't have to just view histamine towards the stomach and the stomach distress there. Even, competitive bodybuilders whose sleep suffers from nasal congestion at nighttime can all play back to histamine, elevated histamine in the body, causing congestion in the sinus cavity. So there's just so many things that we can branch out of this histamine dysregulation, whereby someone's sleep could be severely impacted from lack of nasal breathing and playing into lack of deep sleep. And then, chronic, I guess, you're not really going into that parasympathetic nervous system state during your rest period at nighttime while sleeping, and digestion then suffers there. And you have guys getting heartburn in their sleep. So there's everything there that all ties back to this histamine.
No, and those are great points, because now you're not just looking at, oh, I have reflux. Well, what other symptoms might you be driving up, and it could be kind of almost a symptom of like, because I get bad seasonal allergies. Obviously, there's this drive up in histamine, nasal congestion. I overall feel kind of like puffy and more lethargic. And a lot of these symptoms are histamine driven, which could be the same of what you're experiencing with PED usage. But, and it's kind of like one of these things like, oh, let me go off my labs. And well, if you have the symptoms, it's kind of, that it usually overweighs. So, but a lot of guys are drawing these labs throughout prep, hopefully to kind of monitor themselves. And maybe that might be something they see, because I think maybe a next step is looking at your CBC count, because I think that can be a confusing one to really break down for a lot of guys. But to see like, yeah, basophils, this is related to like, this histamine response, seeing that elevation might give you some further objective data to maybe look at and piece this all together. But no, thanks you for touching on that, Dr. Dean. I'll loop you back around, because I cut you off on talking about DOA and histamine and starting to go further into what we're looking at there.
Yeah, I mean, what I was trying to then bring people away from them was, like you even said with your seasonal allergies, using something like loratadine or Claritin throughout this period is basically just blocking those receptors so that you don't suffer nasal congestion when a pollen allergen lodges in your sinus cavity and triggers that histamine release. But when it comes to then digestive issues, and you mentioned one of them at the start, which are the proton pump inhibitors, they tend to have a severe rebound in that they block this proton pump transport from happening, lowering stomach acid secretion. But it's one of few compounds that actually causes severe rebound, that when you remove the compound, the stomach actually upregulates and starts flooding the stomach with more hydrogen ions to increase stomach acid. That's where the reflux comes back with a vengeance in people who go down the route of PPIs. So using antihistamines would be just more of a crutch to get you through a seasonal period, or even, if you're in this contest phase. But really, we want to try and implement something that's going to stop us from even having to think of removing a symptom and being symptom free. And that's where DAO becomes very important. And DAO, like I said, is diamine oxidase. It's a copper containing enzyme. So what DAO does is it hydrolyzes, it breaks down histamine to be simply excreted then in our urine. A lot of people fail to appreciate their copper needs. And what we tend to see in a lot of bodybuilders is sky-high zinc intake. And that skews the transport of copper, because the two of them act on the same metallothionein complex. So they both share the same sort of transport protein. And we do have to have a balanced ratio of zinc to copper in our bodies, not just for overall health, but it has a critical role in mental health also. So that copper balance is very important, and making sure that we are getting an adequate copper supply. And it's one of the ones that's a little difficult to get from food. So I tend to tell guys, look for a good multivitamin where you're getting about 2 milligrams of a copper chelate. That tends to supply the body with enough copper to take care of DAO, unless you have a genetic deficiency where you're not making enough DAO. Now, DAO, the gene that makes DAO, is called DAO also. And that gene can get slowed down by chronic infections. So like I touched on, parasites. It can get slowed down by high histamine containing foods. So if you're eating a lot of very acidic based foods, or even fermented foods, and this is sort of a catch-22, that you have guys who are ingesting prebiotic and probiotics from, say, fermented foods like sauerkraut or even kombucha, thinking that it's having a positive effect on their digestion. But these fermented foods are actually sky high in histamine. So you're actually just dumping your body with more histamine. Even though you're giving the body some beneficial bacteria, it's sort of outweighing the benefits that you're going to get from that food. So vinegars, kombucha, pickled foods, all these sort of foods that we see guys in sort of a contest scenario try and include in their diet. Oh, let's include sauerkraut for digestive health. Let's add in, pickles to act as an appetite suppressant or as a small snack that's calorie free. And guys aren't really them thinking of, oh, actually, I'm putting more histamine into the body. The other thing then that massively increases histamine is cooling. So cooking your food, allowing it to cool, and then reheating your food. Reheating food turns over, obviously we have bacteria growing on the food, turns over the amount of histamine that these bacteria are creating on the surface of our food, again increasing the histamine content of that food. And similarly, when you're in sort of a contest phase or you have a busy lifestyle, you're prepping days of food in advance, it's going in the fridge, and you're taking it out and you're reheating it in order to eat it. So you're sort of then looking to either, you know, cook food fresh or eat your food cold.
That's a unique one. I don't think most people are going to know that one, because we do live off like the bulk cook method.
Yeah.
Unless you're very privileged and you cook every meal, you know,
exactly.
as it comes. But most people are reheating their foods. And is that more specific to certain foods that have higher rates of bacterial growth versus others?
It would. So it'd be mainly, you know, rice, carbohydrates specifically. You wouldn't really see the histidine content within your you know, animal protein source is going to remain constant. So that they can all play into how DAO operates.
So we like proper food safety, storage, and getting it down to cool temperatures at a reasonable rate, not like cooking your rice and let it sit on the counter overnight, then putting it in the fridge.
Exactly.
I mean, maybe that's nuanced, right? But maybe it does make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, like when guys have dilabating, you know, stomach reflux, any of these small little sort of easy win strategies are going to probably play a big role. Because again, stomach distress, of course, it's a little uncomfortable throughout the day, but it's mainly at nighttime when we start to try and relax, lying flat, the esophageal sphincter completely relaxes. That's when you're going to really suffer. And I guess that's where guys then see some of the side effects.
So do we also see a benefit in something along the lines of like delimiting with trying to upregulate like gastric mucus and stuff like that and helping?
That is a good strategy that I've never even really thought about that you could. But I guess the other side of this is the long-term detriment in terms of degrading that mucus lining of the stomach that leads to an ulcer then.
Yeah.
And that in itself then is sort of something that we're thinking longer term as a negative consequence to upregulate stomach acid. And at that point, then you sort of then fall into a very bleak category where you are going to be relying on proton pump inhibitors to maintain a low stomach acid concentration. But that's going to have a further then, you know, effect into your food intake in the long run. So it really does sort of start coming back to stripping the layers and going back to addressing that basic issue of the increased histamine.
Yes. So that's kind of like the food component that can drive it. So what else would we be looking at dietary wise that can, or supplementation wise, to help with this histamine clearance process?
So mainly, like I said, copper is going to be the first one, and
Okay.
then
I'm sorry, Dr. Dean, you cut out for just you cut out for a few seconds.
DAO in your body.
You had cut out for about 15 seconds. Could you repeat what you said?
Yeah, sorry. So what I was saying was you began looking at to implement the copper first off to improve how DAO functions. And then you can take DAO as a supplement also. So like lipase, amylase, and protease, DAO does exist as a synthetic supplement. And this was sort of then with Supplement Needs, who I formulate with, we created a digestive stack that is geared for the specific improvement of overall digestive health. And that's one of the components in it is 300 micrograms of DAO.
Okay.
But again, lowering the trigger. So if we know that AAS is one of the triggers and we can't really afford that especially in terms of in a contest prep scenario where we're using a very strong binding androgen such as trenbolone, you're then really limited in terms of your compound selection and cosmetic benefit if you had to drop out that compound.
So speaking on that, because we bring up the liver and liver stress driving, of course, a lot of the digestive process, that's needed and things that we're creating are around the liver, bile acids, and a lot of dysfunction around the liver results in poor digestion. And some of these compounds, of course, your methylated orals, have more oxidative stress that present to the liver, but that's also not just dependent on methylated orals, because it's really around the androgen receptor binding in the liver. Exactly. So even then, higher loads of an injectable steroid can still present this liver stress, which can then present into digestive issues. And so it's interesting talking about androgen receptor binding, because we have a lot of that information comes from our the rat studies, right? Looking at binder receptors, and we're like gauging like, oh, this is a strong drug based off of this binding, which we know this isn't quite completely accurate off those bioassays. But there's some orals, like methylated orals, like Anavar, that doesn't necessarily have the strongest binding affinity to the androgen receptor. But then we have like injectables that could present more liver stress. So as a blanket statement of, hey, orals are going to give you more liver and digestive issues, that maybe that's not completely true. Maybe we could touch on that, on the actual, is there a way we can modify compound selection to mitigate the effects, and then what does that mean for liver function and going into digestive health?
So I guess in terms of what culprits would be the main sort of, I guess, for causing digestive issues, and it's probably them all, like what you touched on there. There's not like you can go and blame, I was taking testosterone and now I've added in oxandrolone or oxymetholone. I've added in an oral to improve strength and central nervous system activation, and that's what's caused my liver stress. You now have to take into account central nervous system activation and being in that sympathetic nervous system state quite longer than that parasympathetic nervous system state as a sort of artifact of your training. It's not just necessarily that, oh, the oxymetholone is causing androgen receptor activation in the liver, it's more toxic and therefore I've got more digestive issues. We have to take into account what actually happens again to the physiology when we add in these compounds as well. We also have to then consider, yes, in terms of the oral methylated steroids, we have second pass metabolism occurring as opposed to first pass metabolism only happening with injectables. So in theory, the biotransformation of a methylated oral occurs twice, whereas with injectables, we really have either sulfation or glucuronidation. We have one of those conjugated mechanisms happening after the molecule's been oxidized by CYP. So with the orals, I wouldn't necessarily say that the orals themselves cause liver distress, but what they do play a critical role then is what you talked about is bile acid and bile flow from the gallbladder. And that is a specific problem then in that you can end up with cholestasis. And we have human studies from Dianabol showing this cholestatic jaundice occurring from pure Dianabol use back in the 80s, whereby the cholesterol that should normally be filtered out of the liver through the bile ducts with bile into the small intestine for clearance ends up crystallizing inside the bile ducts. And what you end up happening there is blocking the bile duct, and the bile actually just backflows into the liver. Now, when that bile backflows, it's carrying everything that's toxic, in inverted commas, that's supposed to be draining out into the smaller intestine for elimination and causing hepatocyte injury. So that's where we start to see fibrosis start to occur on top of that oxidative stress when we're trying to use the oxidative mechanisms of the CYPs. That then coupled on top of supraphysiological levels of androgens prevents what we call these buccal stem cells that we have within the spleen from entering into the liver and repairing the liver. So it's sort of a combination of everything in the picture as opposed to the orals themselves being the toxic substance. That hepatocyte injury then will play into obviously how much hepatic digestive enzymes you're going to be making, because you're destroying these cells. And that plays a role then into the pancreas having to try and make up for some of that deficiency, because the two of them sort of work in tandem, where, you know, when a person has their gallbladder removed, that bile comes from somewhere else, which is mainly either the liver and a small bit from the pancreas. So we then start to put stress on that system to try and make up for this injury that's occurring in the background.
And that of course makes a lot of sense. And I think a lot of people have only associated using orals and hepatic stress, and that's not the case. It's truly the devil is probably in the dosage of these things. So I know we bring up trenbolone, and it binds the androgen receptor strong enough, but if you take enough of any one of these drugs, like you'll run into these same issues, whether it's enough testosterone or primobolan or whichever you're choosing. The devil's in the dose. Like milligram for milligram, things are stronger than others. But if you're taking 3 times of a weaker drug, well, now it's a strong drug, right? But those common issues the most common issue in steroid use around the liver is cholestasis and buildup of bile acids, which definitely could impede your ability to emulsify fats and digest them and slow down that whole digestive process. Around this liver stress, obviously the thing is, hey, drop your dose back, bro. But when is this not the situation? What are things to have in place that can support that process of methylation in the liver, and also removing bile acids and not allowing them to back up?
Yeah. So what you can then do is you can, again, this is sort of when I'm formulating for supplement needs, I'm going back to that. What is the root cause? And with the liver stack that I made, was this exact scenario. Why do we see liver problems in bodybuilders? And it all points at the gallbladder and bile. So if we can stop that cholestasis from forming, we help to preserve how the liver transports fats. So again, we don't want fatty liver disease building up from inadequate transport of fats out into the small intestine. What we can look at is implementing a synthetic form of bile in the form of ox bile, which is pretty much, I'm not going to say bioidentical, but almost very similar to what humans produce in terms of its bile acid content. So we can use ox bile as a synthetic form of bile to help emulsify those fats, to then ensure that the bile ducts themselves are receiving adequate flow of bile and pushing that cholesterol down into the small intestine. We can then look at improving, I guess, the viscosity of the bile with bile acid conjugates like TUDCA or UDCA, whichever form a person wishes to use. And all you're doing there again is just improving the viscosity and the flow of that bile so that it's not as viscous to cause cholestasis within the bile ducts. Then the choline and non-acetal are 2 very critical compounds that feed into how the liver transports triglycerides. Choline, if guys, again, this comes back to then a pre-contest setup in terms of diet. Choline-rich foods tend to be quite fat-rich, so we're talking about mainly, egg yolks, which aren't going to really be in abundance when it comes to a pre-contest bodybuilder's diet. They're not really going to have the majority of fat coming from egg yolks. So either they're going to implement choline as a supplement or phosphatidylcholine as a supplement also to improve the bile flow within their liver. And this sort of ties into, as an aside, pregnant women who suffer with nausea tends to be from a lack of choline within their liver, and obviously that plays into the gallbladder. And that can play then into the histamine and nausea that happens with morning sickness and pregnancy.
I was going to mention, isn't there also a link within Alzheimer's disease, increases in histamine and lack of choline, and how that system has some interplay.
Yeah, and the same with elevated histamine playing into Parkinson's also. So histamine isn't just like this one compound. It has so much global effects that it can be classified as a neurotransmitter as well.
And I think that's because, you know, with what we do, like your main organ systems, like a lot of people talk about the liver, I know, but for me, like brain, kidney, heart, like these are three systems that are so important in PED use, take the biggest hits, and not you'll see in long term. So, and part of this could be around this, could we say elevated histamine levels affecting with lack of choline over years and years of doing this could be impactful.
Yeah.
Maybe choline might be something that we should have supplementing in the background always. Would you say so, or just during times that we're in contest prep and we're lacking those sources in the diet?
No, so I can't see any reason why you couldn't include, say, 800 milligrams of choline and 800 milligrams of inositol, a balanced ratio of the 2 year round. We just have to take into account that when we have very high choline intake, it can have a positive impact in that it can lower your blood pressure significantly. So for people who are hypotensive, this can be a nightmare, but for people who are borderline hypertensive, it can actually bring their blood pressure down about 10 points. And we see that with people who take quite high dosages of liposomal products, because liposomal products are made from a phosphatidylcholine base.
And I've seen you recommend one too, because we're on the topic of liver function, liposomal glutathione. And at least here in the United States, there was a recent, there's some discussion on N-acetylcysteine being now as a pharmaceutical drug, and it's been pulled from a lot of the sellers. And so a lot of people are like, what do we take to replace our N-acetylcysteine? And maybe you might touch on liposomal glutathione.
Yeah, so glutathione is sort of the master antioxidant that your body produces as a conjugative mechanism for eliminating toxic substances from your liver. So just to keep it really simple, your liver has two metabolic transformation pathways. We call them phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 is biotransformations. So we're destroying the structure of that compound to change its function. So in other words, say for testosterone, we're going to change a little part of the molecule so it's no longer testosterone technically. Now that in itself may not actually be useful to remove the compound from the body because it still has to be excreted. And we have the two main sort of sources of excretion, and that's our urine for water-soluble compounds and then our feces for fat-soluble. So the liver then has to do another biotransformation through phase 2, and that's a conjugative mechanism where it attaches a molecule like glutathione or like a glucuronate or like a sulfate, any of these compounds that then make the compound more water soluble to be allowed to be transported to the kidneys for excretion. So glutathione acts in that phase 2 conjugation mechanism, but our environment, our current environment puts a heavy stress on glutathione within our body. We have several environmental factors. We have the food we ingest. We have electromagnetic radiation exposure that can cause oxidative stress. And obviously then our body has to use glutathione to mitigate that oxidative stress. So we're sort of in this environment now where we really heavily rely on this antioxidant in order to offset oxidative stress and the diseases that come from it. N-acetylcysteine, as you said, fed into providing a sulfur donor source in order for your body to create glutathione. So glutathione, we have several enzymes in the body that recycles. When glutathione is reduced and it's used to its oxidized form, we can then replenish our glutathione stores by adding more cysteine or sulfur donors into the system to keep that glutathione recycling. Liposomal glutathione then was developed as a method to improve the bioavailability of oral reduced glutathione. So you could take oral reduced glutathione as a supplement, but it only has roughly a 5 to 10% bioavailability. So you lose the majority of what you're taking, specifically because glutathione is just 3 amino acids that have been conjugated together. The liposomal products then bypass this stomach hydrolysis because the glutathione now is microencapsulated inside a phospholipid membrane. And what's beneficial here is obviously phospholipids can pass through the phospholipid membrane of our cells themselves, become lysed, and deliver the contents inside the cell where it's needed. Aside from the liver, the main sort of powerhouses in our body that utilize glutathione is the mitochondria. So we're sort of feeding, as the mitochondria oxidize glucose and go through glycolysis, they're producing free radicals that require an antioxidant from glutathione to stop damage to the inside of our cells. And, you know, if you look at the uncoupling mechanism, say, for example, of DNP, that's one of the negative side effects that can lead to the likes of cataracts, is because of the mitochondria in your eyes are getting heavily damaged. And as one of the regions in your body has actually the most amount of mitochondria. So when we see that oxidative stress happening in the eyes leading to cataracts, it's actually because DNP has caused so much uncoupling inside those cells that it requires glutathione intake to offset that oxidative stress from that excessive uncoupling. So glutathione is definitely something that someone in a pre-contest phase could implement, but it all comes back to blood work. Then we can look at how glutathione is being recycled in blood work by looking at GGT, which is gamma glutamyl transferase. It's a peptide that's involved in the recycling of glutathione. If we start to see elevations in GGT, then we know that there's actually a deficiency of glutathione within the system. And most recently, what's sort of interesting here is GGT can actually play as a predictor towards oxidative stress that leads to cardiovascular disease. So we're sort of looking at optimally within blood work, GGT falling somewhere between 16 and 20. Yet, you know, your reference lab range goes anywhere up to 10 to 70. So we have this really distinct range that we know from current literature in the last 10 years that for optimal health, we should be striving for GGT between 16 and 20. Not just for liver health, but also for cardiovascular.
I tell guys to add on GGT onto their labs. And would you, this is what I say, correct me if I'm wrong, but the GGT enzyme is more liver specific than AST and ALT, because I've seen like AST, ALT have some slight elevations, and possibly this is more training related, but their GGT is within that, like, you know, that correct reference range. Deciphering between those, would you say, you know, if you fell within that, would GGT be more specific to liver stress versus the others?
It possibly could, or what I would add on would be ALP, because your alkaline phosphatase is actually specific to the liver. But you can also, this is another aside because we're discussing it, AST and ALT operate within a specific ratio within the body. So you sort of look, what is the ratio between the two? If it's anything over 1, then we know that there is fibrosis risk happening in the liver. If it's less than 1, so say you have elevations in AST and ALT where the reference range is up to, I think, 60 for both. Say both of them are 75 and 75, well, then we know that the ratio between the two of them is 1. So there's no specific liver injury risk there due to the ratio of the two. It's almost when the two of them become sort of 2:1, then you need to start worrying that there's actual liver injury happening and the hepatocytes are being broken down and releasing these enzymes into the body.
Does that go either way with them, or is it one?
So the AST to ALT ratio, so the AST, if that's higher than 1 to ALT, then you're looking at liver injury. Generally, if you look at any blood work, that AST to ALT ratio is normally less than 1, and there's minimal risk. But that's another way of deciphering if there's liver injury happening. But GGT, as you said, because it is specific to the liver and it plays a role in that glutathione recycling, if there is a a skew, and that we know there is stress happening at the liver where we're not producing enough GGT. That could be either, like you said, hepatocyte injury, or it could be an artifact of your nutrient intake where you're not actually taking in enough sulfur donor sources from either N-acetylcysteine or foods, or you may need to implement, liposomal glutathione to just push that GGT production along.
So you're saying, like, you might, if we saw an elevation of AST, ALT, and low GGT, that would be problematic versus like an elevation of GGT, like we want the higher level of GTT.
So low can be actually more as detrimental as high GGT. Okay. Low GGT still reflects back onto your glutathione state, because also when glutathione gets broken down, it can go down a glutamate pathway. So you can lose your glutathione level, your glutathione recycling capability to glutamate. So that's where that GGT becomes important as well. We look at whether it's low or whether it's high. If it's high, we can turn that back to there is a high conversion rate of our glutathione because you have more of that enzyme present. And then when the GGT is very low, we have low recycling capability of glutathione. And does that play into, are we using up glutathione too fast and not making enough GGT? Or is it that we have a low glutathione system as well? So it's a very complex one, but I'm glad you brought that up, because people tend to look at it and think, oh, it's GGT, but it really is a critical one when we look at how the liver itself works.
Yeah, I felt like we couldn't have this discussion today without talking about the liver. All these organ systems are integrated in some extent. So, and I know where our focus is going to be on like reflux, right? Kind of around, but and I know like we're coming up on our hour here. So to kind of loop this all back, we have our bodybuilder that's been constant food basis, implemented PEDs and having this reflux occur. We don't have the option to lower compound selection during this phase. So that's like not an option. So we're gonna, within this, make sure that we are supporting those systems that can remove histamine. So have an adequate amount of copper, DOA. Maybe we should look at supplement needs for Dr. Dean's digestive support. You can plug that, Dr. Dean.
Yeah, I mean, like when we released the digestive stack, and then we've released a new product today called Glucox, which is like a GDA. When I'm making these products, I'm very mindful that with the digestive stack, for example, it's not a product that you're going to pop at every single meal. It's not like a digestive enzyme. If you want that, buy some other brands, pancreatin complex. This is specifically designed to control or improve those parietal cells within your stomach. So they rely on, so this is where, again, we come back to copper and zinc. The parietal cells of the stomach need zinc. Histamine needs copper. Okay. Most bodybuilders will have an abundance of zinc within their body and low copper. But what can also happen is you can have lack of zinc specifically within the parietal cells, whereby the proton pumps aren't working efficiently then. So with the digestive stack, it was more so a product that you'd take in the morning time that would improve how you digest your first meal, play a role into increase in your stomach acid if you have low stomach acid, have the DAO present to help lower any histamine from overnight, and then we have, a standardized ginger extract where the gingerols are helping with stomach motility to bring back appetite, basically. So it's not like when I'm making these things, I'm not thinking, let's just take something to get rid of the symptom. We go back, to where we started with the root cause and trying to improve the symptoms coming from the root cause.
No, and I think that makes the most sense of trying to solve any of these problems is starting at the root issue. And so we're having these root issues, implementing something like that as the supportive role for the root cause would make the most sense, like the product that you had formulated. Then the same bodybuilder can look through the food sources that they're implementing too that might be driving up histamine, right? So the high fermentable foods, looking at reheating foods in that process, if for some reason maybe they're using more packaged meats or things of this nature that would have a high possibility.
Cured meats, smoked meats, smoked fish, all these play into histamine as well because of how they've been cured. So it could be as simple as for, I guess, convenience sake, you're going to the store and you're just buying cooked chicken breast in a cooked pack.
I've done it deli turkey, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, okay, it's simple, it's easy, but and I understand that. So we look at the food sources next, and then from there, if we're still having these issues, say with reflux, then that might be when we have some other type of like you mentioned, you had Zantac. Is that what you had Luke doing? But there's other options though, right? If you're still having reflux.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, I mean, even the likes of Claritin that we use for hay fever will have global antihistamine effects.
Benadryl? So I've used Benadryl to help with sleep at night, but it's also an antihistamine.
Yes, you can use Benadryl as well. The diphenhydramine is also similar to the loratadine and Claritin. I think it's a second generation antihistamine. So you're going to end up with global antihistamine, I guess, histamine receptor antagonism, where you're blocking the histamine receptor. So you could definitely, if you're struggling, especially at reflux at nighttime, taking Benadryl before sleep is going to play into that histamine, blocking that histamine while sleeping and offsetting that reflux as well.
And then the application, like if someone's like, oh, I'm just going to use this PPI, would you have you used zinc carnosine as an alternative to this at all?
Yeah, and that's what's within the digestive stack is zinc carnosine, 150 milligrams of zinc carnosine, because obviously the carnosine plays into how that proton pump works, and then the zinc plays an important role in the actual parietal cell itself.
Of course, so then we're getting more zinc in competing with copper, right?
Exactly. So really comes down to this very minutia of when you have to really be critical of that person's intake of zinc. And that's another warning I make with the digestive stack is if you're taking other sources of zinc, you have to be mindful that you're pushing your zinc load further away from your copper. And in itself, high zinc can be more detrimental than high copper or low copper. So that's another thing as well, just sort of to close it off, is you have to truly think of, is this a overproduction of stomach acid or underproduction of stomach acid? Both will result in the same symptom of heartburn. Most people chronically have low stomach acid from not chewing their food, so there's inadequate mechanical digestion in the mouth, and then the stomach isn't making enough pepsinogen and hydrochloric acid to break down those peptides then efficiently. So you end up then with this low stomach acid setting. And ultimately then when that passes into the small intestine, you have fermentation and bad gas. So it's, you're sort of looking at the symptoms of, am I chronically burping, which is a sign of low stomach acid?
Okay.
Am I having bad foul smelling gas, which is another sign of maldigestion of protein? And you're all playing that back then to, okay, this all makes sense. Then I've actually low stomach acid, and my reflux and heartburn is actually because of the food that is within my stomach isn't actually being effectively digested properly, and that food volume is allowing that food to push on the sphincter and allow some of the acid to burn the esophagus.
In that application, then I've used like betaine HCl.
Yeah.
Supportive along with meals, just to raise up the hydrochloric acid content.
Yeah, and that's a great solution. And the betaine HCl will always have pepsin in it as well. So it's even for myself, I went through a period where I actually done a test for Helicobacter pylori, because I was actually starting to really question my own digestive health one year, because of the symptoms I was having in my stomach. That test came back negative, but as soon as I started implementing quite a high dose of betaine HCl to start, and then slowly titrating down, my stomach acid production has been perfect since. So it's definitely, it's one of those ones that taking a couple of betaine HCl capsules might help, but based off what we sort of read and how we use betaine HCl as a supplement, we try and get to that upper ceiling of how many you can take before we start to feel the effects of the increased HCl. Because obviously how betaine HCl works is the betaine cleaves away and leaves the hydrochloride salt in the stomach to increase the levels of hydrochloric acid. So we can effectively then provide the body with betaine, which is also a metal donor that plays into methylation and obviously the liver health, but also the HCl and to increase the stomach acid content. So don't be afraid to play with the dose of betaine HCl. Most bottles will just say take one with a meal. Yeah. You have to find what's sort of the sweet spot for that protein content based on what your stomach acid is producing.
I've heard people taking up to like 10 pills with a meal.
Yeah, I've been there. And then you can actually test. It's a very like old wives' way of testing stomach acid, but you make up a concentrated solution of baking soda and water. You drink it and you time how long it takes you to burp.
Yeah.
And obviously
that's fasted in the morning.
Fasted in the morning. So what you're looking at there is a simple neutralization reaction where the carbonate gets neutralized to produce carbon dioxide and you burp. I think it's like if you burp within, I think it's been two or 2.5 minutes, you have adequate stomach acid.
It's like quarter teaspoon baking soda with 5 ounces of water, especially in the morning.
That's it.
Well, and that's a test. I mean, then of course, if you just implement betaine HCl, if you start taking them, it's like my stomach acid's worse, I have more burning. Well, that's probably also like, well, okay, you probably have enough acid. It's probably the maybe it's the other way.
With the histamine.
Right. So that, that kind of gives you some clear ways to filter through those waters. And then lastly, just to sum up what we had talked about, also supporting liver function with some type of support for phase 1, phase 2 conjugation detoxification, like using a liposomal glutathione, but then also supporting this bile system. So having something with like ox bile and then TUCA and choline and inositol all support that system to relieve the stress that might be in place from using anabolic steroids.
Yeah.
Right? And so that kind of, I think that really rounds out a good framework for people having those issues in the background and how we give some support role to it. Is there anything that we missed throughout that conversation, Dr. Dean, that you want to touch on or close on?
I guess one final aside that would also be, we've been looking at androgens. Estradiol itself can also, a high estrogen load can play into imbalanced histamine. So again, it sort of comes back to, if we are using high amounts of aromatizable compounds, that we're actually looking at where estradiol is sitting as well, because that can have an effect into liver function as well as then a histamine imbalance. So it sort of ties everything back together again, that, like we said, it's probably not just one specific compound that we can call the devil. It's actually the details and how much you're taking.
And then we have like a complication of like polypharmacy occurring, which, even because I've seen, if I have tracking of blood glucose over time and individuals using growth hormone, and we're seeing this glucose rise and kind of this insulin resistance form, I see this coincide with a drop off in digestion and appetite with elevations in glucose levels. I'm sure some of these glucose transporters, GLP-1, they're all affected within getting a little bit of insulin resistance, and probably the background driver is inflammation occurring. And I'm sure that's another one to go down as far as getting the right support with the inflammatory processes and increasing insulin sensitivity as well. Would you agree to that?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I guess then it all comes back to what I sort of said at the start, and it's all triggered by food volume and that lack of sensitivity, or the loss of sensitivity to the body chronically over time. And, as bodybuilders, we tend to form this heavy married relationship to the food we're currently eating and not willing to take a break.
Right.
When sometimes that's actually probably the best thing for your body. We also have to sort of view digestion as an aging process. So if we're constantly driving digestion all the time, we're driving mTOR, we're aging the body at a faster rate than what an average individual would be doing with lower food volume. And that sort of then plays into the argument that, as boring as they are, regular periods of fasting throughout an off season can be, a driver of health and a driver of keeping digestion healthy throughout that whole process.
Yeah, I think it's, and I've done this too. I think it's the mindset you have to get out of, like if you're in this, especially it's blast phases when guys are like, no, I only push food up, body weight must only increase. And it's like, if you just even took a week in that phase where like, hey, you're noticing this creep up, pull back on food, decrease, that load and strain, then go back and you'll see like probably stabilization of blood glucose, improvement in digestion, have some days where you have some fasting in place. And in 1 week, in the big, long scheme of what we're doing here is not going to hold you back. But also you're bringing to the point of this is the rationale of having these almost a maintenance phase or a health phase, if you want to call it. Because I hate maintenance phase. I sell it to some guys and they're like, maintenance, like, dude, it's only grow more and no maintenance. And it's like, okay, well, let's call it something different. But health phase, or I usually call them solidification phases, right? You solidify the gains. But a lot of that process is also like health, longevity in mind. But I think that's what doing these podcasts with you is what we're trying to bring more awareness from, and having an approach that is less risky and than what has been done, and bringing just awareness that these are even issues that are happening in the background that you should be aware of.
Yeah.
So, thank you for sharing your knowledge and everything you've done to push this forward to the forefront. It's truly appreciated.
No, I'm very glad to come on and even just share what I know if people are willing to listen. I mean, like you said at the start, I just started off on Trained by JP as just as a member, just answering questions. And that was the only sort of forum I was involved in, because as I was getting older, I started to see that we have these questions in bodybuilding that there has to be clear science to them. And we have to sort of start moving away from this, oh, just take X for this problem. Actually start telling people, you know what, you have this problem because this has gone wrong. And this is how we fix it from day dot. And, we can get your health back on track without actually suffer now and then fix it later. So I think that's critically important as we move into these next few future years of bodybuilding and obviously health and fitness, that people become aware of this mentality of let's get to the root cause and implement a strategy there rather than dealing with the consequences later on.
Yeah, I think it's an exciting time, and even for general health and medicine, because a lot of people are now learning that you really need to be your own advocate for your healthcare. And there's a lot more out on progressive healthcare and functional medicine, and getting down to root causes before you just give in like, here's this drug for this symptom. And we're seeing it kind of widespread now too in the world. And so I think that it does leak into, and maybe it starts in health and fitness because we are more progressive and looking at root issues to solve problems. But I think it is an exciting area, but looking to the future, I would definitely agree. But again, thank you for coming on and truly appreciate it. This is J3U podcast, and we will talk to you next time. Thanks, everybody.